Yeah, Cavalry at its core really is a powerful 2D animation application. And the idea is that it brings design, data, and automation together in motion.
Cavalry is node-based behind the scenes, but you don't have to deal with them. It's all layer-based on top. Like we swallow all of the technical differences and you just drag a connection and then you're done.
We hear lots of stories of people kind of hitting happy accidents in Cavalry where they didn't mean something to happen, but oh, that looks cool. Let's go with that now.
All right, Chris and Ian, before we jump into your very interesting backstory and we learn all about Cavalry, I want to make sure that everyone listening actually understands what Cavalry is, just in case they haven't heard of it yet. So, you guys, I just learned actually have some investors, so I'm assuming at some point you had to have the elevator pitch for this. So what's the elevator pitch for Cavalry?
Yeah, we certainly did. So yeah, Cavalry at its core really is a powerful 2D animation application. It's desktop, so for macOS and Windows. And the idea is that it brings design, data, and automation together in motion. And just to kind of expand on that a little bit, Cavalry is very open-ended, so it can do a lot of things. It gets used for all sorts of different pieces like, generative art, so kind of processing like things, FUIs, data viz, character animation, UI, UX, motion design, all sorts of different things. And really what we're trying to do with Cavalry is make sure that you keep that open-ended approach so you can use Cavalry as a kind of really creative playground and build anything you like in there. But on the other end of the kind of delivery side of things is making sure that you've got an app that is capable of dealing with really a modern media landscape where you need different aspect ratios, different languages, different call to actions, all the different versions that you're having to output. And so that's where the data and automation side comes in. And you're not having to jump in and out of different apps to do that. So Cavalry is kind of that end-to-end workflow, putting all of those different elements together.
Excellent. Well, it sounds complicated, and I want to get into how hard it was to build and how it works and some of the kind of unique things that it can do. But I kind of wanted to start with the origin story. And so, Ian, I'll go to you first. I was doing my research for this, and I found this Medium article that was written years ago. And you were kind of talking about the genesis of Cavalry. And there was this line in there that caught my eye. While working at Mainframe, awesome studio, I'd created an animation toolkit for Autodesk Maya called Mash. Now, I'm not a Maya guy, but I've heard of Mash, right? I worked at studios where, but before Cinema 4D was really kind of like the king in motion design, the studio I was at was using Maya, and I'm sure they were using Mash because they were doing kind of motion designy things. And I need to know, like, what were you trying to do in Maya that you were having trouble doing, or it was so painful that you're like, I'm actually going to just make my own tool to do this?
That was so painful, I can remember it vividly. So it was 13 years ago, and it was a music video for Cher Lloyd, and it was called Swagger Jagger. And this is a terrible song, so no one should go and look this up. It's got like 100 million views on YouTube somehow. But basically, I animated the first, I think it was about 35 seconds of that music video. And there were loads of these kind of white tiles on the floor unfolding. And it was quite complex animation. And it was just very difficult to do that in Maya. And so I scripted the whole thing about just thousands of shapes unfolding. And the whole thing was just, lots and lots of code. And the problem with building scenes like that is that you can't hand them off to anyone because there's so much scripting involved in them that someone else opens that file and wants to make a change. They can't. So you can't get ill while you're on that production because you're the only person who can work that file, basically. Right. And so I went away and I started working on some, it's like a suite of tools that you could, the parts, like Lego blocks, that you could put together that would help you build complex animations in Maya, basically. And we used that for the first time on, I think it was her second music video, We Are Your Love or something, I can't remember, where there was kind of thousands of balloons kind of floating up over London. And so that was the first time it got used. And it got picked up. It got picked up pretty quickly. Well, Chris decided it was too good to keep in-house, and so we should make it public, basically. And so that happened, we just went on from there.
And so eventually Autodesk ended up acquiring this and incorporating it into Maya, correct? Maybe you could tell that story real quick.
Yeah, okay. So I was on a forum and I made a mention that I thought I had an idea of how 3D type tools in Maya could be improved. And that got us an email from someone at Autodesk saying, do you want to develop these new 3D type tools for Maya? And so we did that as a piece of contracting. And this happened as Mash was being released to the public. And so they were aware of who we were because of this work. And then Mash kind of exploded. So a bit of relief in the community because finally some motion graphics tools. And Autodesk acquired it pretty quickly. I think it was in 2016. And so Mash hadn't been around long when that happened. And after actually, so the acquisition, I was remembering this today, actually, Chris. Do you remember when Autodesk contacted us to say, we're thinking about buying Mash. You give us a tour of it. And so Chris and I organized this meeting with 25 people at Autodesk. And It was for this time on this day. And Chris and I kind of got together an hour before the meeting. And we went through the meeting to practice the meeting on my computer, and we're going, we'll show them this, we'll do this, and hopefully they'll be sold on it and they'll want to buy it from us. And we were doing this, we did this test for an hour, and then we came off the test, and my inbox was just full of emails from all these people at Autodesk saying, what aren't you on the call? Why aren't you on the call? Where are you? and what happened was daylight savings had happened in Canada, but not in the UK, and so we missed the meeting by an hour. So, oh well. Anyway, we managed to arrange it a couple of weeks later, and then they decided to take Mash off our hands, and then we contracted on that for another 3.5 years, I think. So, it was really well received in Maya. So I got told a story a couple of years ago about how you don't really change software versions when you're on big productions. So Maya mainly motion picture stuff, right? VFX for motion pictures and animation for motion pictures. And you never switch versions during a production. So you can be using the same version of Maya for 3-4 years while you're working on a show. And I was told a story about how on one particular show, they had about 6 months left on a film called Alita Battle Angel. Mm-hmm. There were 6 months of production time left, and they were 3 months behind schedule. And they were trying to do all these kind of like set populations and things with their own built-in tools, and it wasn't working. And someone convinced them with 3 months to go, they need to switch to Mash. So internally said, just upgrade your versions mid-production and go for it. And they finished on time by doing that. So it was a nice story. So it got really quickly adopted, and well received. I would hope so.
That's awesome. Okay, so you caught lightning in a bottle one time with Mash. That's really cool. You kind of scratched your own itch. And so now you guys are working on Cavalry. Chris, there was another line in that article that I thought it could not be more of an understatement. I have this much experience building software, way less than you guys. But even the little amount I've seen, I'm just staggered by how complex it is and how hard it is to do. You're quoted as, "It's fair to say none of us actually had any idea of the scale of the project upon which we were embarking when we started Cavalry." Maybe you could just comment on that. And that was a few years ago now. I'm sure you have bigger problems now. So what did you mean by that?
So, I think, in fact, before I answer that question, Ian's been a little bit modest and he's missed a crucial part of that Mash story out, which was that he is an Oscar nominee. Lead
with that, Ian. Jeez.
Autodesk were, kind of invited by the Academy. They have a part of the Academy called the SciTech Awards. And Ian, you were up against some luminary names, weren't you? We say nominee because we didn't win, but we got very close.
Yeah, so that year. So I think, I met Dave Simmons when this happened. So we got told that Mash was being considered for a SciTech Oscar. I flew out to Los Angeles. I was in the middle of a holiday. I was out on the South Coast, Brighton, with my family, and they basically said, you need to be on a plane on Wednesday to go to LA to go and get interviewed by the Academy and go and give a lightning talk. And at the lightning talk, firstly, I embarrassed myself in front of John Knoll, which was brilliant. And secondly, I met Dave Simmons, who is one of the creators of After Effects. And he said, don't worry if you don't win an Oscar this time. This is our 14th attempt. So, but they did win. They did win that year. So undeservedly so.
That's great. I can't believe you don't have Oscar-nominated team on Scene Group's website. I would definitely lead with that. Okay, so Chris, back to the. That was a really good story, though. By the way, thank you for that. That's awesome. So Chris, what's been difficult about this? What did you underestimate?
Well, I think the underestimation is to say we underestimated it is probably an underestimation in itself.
Right.
That whole experience with Mash and Autodesk, we were hearing from Autodesk employees like, how do you guys produce so much in this time? You've done 2 years work in a month, and And really, that was down to the freedom that we had as a small team. We were really kind of an external small team working within Autodesk, and we were just sort of given the free rein to go and do what we need to do. So we were outside all of those kind of corporate machinations, that you get kind of rolled in if you're in these big corporations. So we came into this project thinking, how long is it really going to take to put together a 2D software animation? It's one less dimension. It's going to be easy.
Right.
I think I remember telling you it would be 18 months.
Yeah.
That's famous last words. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I think it's really important to go into these things with naivety. That there is no way that we would have started this project if you gave me a to-do list of all the things that we've done since Ian and another guy, Martin, who's no longer with us at Scene Group. But, Ian and Martin kind of kicked off all the early development in this and the R&D, and it was really, really exciting. And we were moving at lightning pace, and, everything was just going our way. And, not to say that stopped in any way. We still kind of work like that. But, in a way, Cavalry is the tip of the iceberg, right? There's licensing systems to build. We're running AWS servers. We've got automations that talk to CRMs. We've got API integrations. We've got custom documentation. There's so much stuff going on underneath to make Cavalry a possibility. So there's no way you can plan for all these things, I don't think. And good for us, really. I think it worked really well in our favor. Cavalry would not exist without us being overly confident about the whole situation.
Naivety, pure naivety.
I think it has to be that way because, if you're building an internal tool, and I think a lot of motion designers have a small version of this, maybe they use ChatGPT to build a script for After Effects or something like that. It's one thing when you're using the tool and no one's paying you for it. And it's a completely different thing when you're accepting money and you have users. And now if you push an update and it breaks, people are going to be angry. So did you have any sense of sort of the scale of it? I mean, you'd done Mesh already, but that was built on top of an existing platform with an enormous team behind it. So obviously this felt different, but kind of in what way was this different?
Yeah, I mean, Ian, you might be better to answer this, but your point there, Joey, to Mesh being built on top of an existing bit of software, that does take a lot of the pressure around all the other things that need to happen around that software as well from us. So we were really able to just focus purely on that, purely on the functionality really of Mesh. Whereas, Ian, you're obviously kind of focused on the development side of things, but you're obviously kind of intrinsically involved in the business as well. You now see development through God, how long is this going to take? And, who's really going to benefit from this? So the way that you approach all these tasks really changes, I think. Certainly when it's your baby, everything, we're responsible for everything all the way through. So it's a big change. It's a big mindset shift, I think, as well, because... I think as you alluded to there, Joey, that responsibility of something not working, it's our fault. It's not Autodesk's fault. We can't blame the host application that our plugin doesn't work. It's all down to us. And yeah, that's really, really changed things. The inverse to that is the control that we've had. When Ian and Martin were building out Cavalry's engine back in the early days, it was kind of a really interesting experience. That's not something that I'm not really a developer myself. It's not something that I was particularly well versed in. But it was really interesting trying to predict all the things that Cavalry is going to have to be able to do in the future, knowing that this engine, we can update the engine, but it's so intrinsic to everything we build on top of it. You have to really think, right, who is going to use Cavalry? What are they going to use it for? Why are they, what is it they're going to want to do with it? So it's, very, very different approach. And we were not, that naivety still plays into it. There's things we got wrong in that time. There's things that we know that we could have done better and we will improve over time. But it's really different. There's a really different kind of outlook to it.
Yeah, it can so easily be a wicked problem when you're designing something like this from the ground up. You might get to a version 1 or something and then realize you have to start again. You have to go completely from scratch because you've you got something fundamental wrong, basically. So we were really lucky in that we had, this, as Chris alluded to before, we got the 6-week planning period before we even wrote a line of code where we just drew lots of lines and kind of what we wanted to build and what we wanted people to be able to do with the software. And thankfully, we've been good. We built a solid foundation, and we're still there. And we've had no wicked problems, so we hadn't had to rebuild everything, or we haven't chosen. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, whatever.
It was a really interesting moment as well, because we kind of ran Cavalry as almost like an internal pitch at Mainframe. And so, I think, Ian, you had a concept, and correct me, I hope I'm getting this right, the chronology of this, but you had a concept, and then we went, this sounds really interesting. Go away, if you and Martin go away for a month and flesh this out, and basically put a pitch document together. And we all went, wow, this sounds really cool. Let's do it. And that's really how it started.
So something he's bringing up there, because we got that wrong. So we did put this pitch document together, and we went to a coffee shop. We pitched, Martin and I pitched Chris, and we this is what we want to build. And it's probably important to mention that what we pitched was an animation program for the web. So it did say animation for the web. So basically, like a new version of Flash, basically, is what we pitched, because I, background in interaction design and all that kind of thing. So really keen on that. And it was motion graphics and all that kind of thing, but we wanted to output to the web. We wanted people to be able to view the animations on the web in a kind of Lottie-esque way. And we ended up with Rive appearing. And so, thankfully, we didn't go down that route, because we can't compete with the American VC money. So it turns out that we've accidentally done the right thing by, going down the road that Chris was talking about before, about the going after data and all the different design fields that we've ended up targeting. So yeah,
that's hilarious. Lucky. So let's start digging into Cavalry a little bit, and I want to come back to what you're saying about building the engine, because I think we hear from like all kinds of artists all over the industry, and everyone uses After Effects if they're doing 2D animation. That's just what you use. But there's a lot of issues that artists have working with After Effects that I think mostly come from the fact that it's 25 years old or something like that, and I know from talking with some of the developers on After Effects that one of the biggest challenges they have is that the core engine that calculates what the pixels look like on the viewer, some of that technology is decades old, and decisions that were made way before we sort of knew what the modern use cases of After Effects were going to be. Some of those decisions are now technical debt that the current day developers have to deal with. So how did you think about that when you were thinking about Cavalry? Because obviously you had some vision for what you were going to aim at.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine you predicted exactly the way people are going to be using it these days.
Well, interestingly, we didn't come far off that. So going back to what you were saying about After Effects, another interesting story there is we developed some stuff for After Effects while we were contracted for Autodesk. And so this is going to sound like I'm bashing After Effects. I love it. It's a beautiful, elegant compositor. It's great. The After Effects team are wonderful. But we were developing a live link between Maya and After Effects, and we kind of wanted to make a first-class experience, the kind of thing that we were used to doing on the Maya end, and we couldn't work out how to do certain things. And we got in touch with the After Effects team, and we said, we need some hooks, we need some APIs. Can you please give us this, and this? And they sent us an email back saying, no, and maybe in a few years. And none of it's happened. And that's the problem when you're building a really old system like that, is that you have all this technical debt, and you can't, it's not easy to update it all. So, but when we built Cavalry around this idea of concepts, so we have concepts of like behaviors, layers, keyframes, all this kind of thing. And, when we kind of like designed these ways of working. And so, for example, the first time I showed Chris and Martin anything that was kind of like there was a progenitor of Cavalry, it was just some workflows. It was kind of, how about if you worked like this? And I kind of showed a couple of workflows, and then it all came from a way of working rather than features or rather than a need. It was more like motion designers should be working like this because it's more efficient, because it's a nicer way to work. And that's where the whole thing started. So
so there are things in After Effects that are pretty trivial to do in, say, Cinema 4D and in Cavalry, right? If you want your screen to be filled with 200 little circles and then have a field that moves through them where they scale up when they're close to that field, you can do that in After Effects. but it requires, some finagling, right? You probably have to have some expressions, or you got to buy a third-party tool, and it's pretty clunky. And, when you're talking about building Mesh, you had this like specific job that you were doing where there was an effect you needed, and it was just so painful to do it, so you built the tool that does that. And it turns out other people had that same problem. Was there a moment like that kind of triggered this idea of the way Cavalry works, which if anyone hasn't used it, it is procedural. It works. If you've used the MoGraph tools in Cinema 4D, I find them to be similar in the kind of the philosophy behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of it came from the things that we were needing to do in 3D. So one of the ideas behind Mesh, I think one of the things on the PowerPoint originally, or Keynote originally, was bringing the 3D innovations into 2D. There was so many innovations have been happening in the world of 3D over the years, and so few have been happening in 2D. We wanted to bring some of that lot over, and so things like MoGraph Mesh, that kind of thing, implicit fields from Houdini, all that kind of stuff, and we wanted to establish a way of working where you wouldn't have to backtrack ever, so nothing was ever baked in. So that's where the procedural stuff comes from. But it's just a recipe. Basically, you're seen as a recipe rather than it being baked in. Something is done. It's kind of reruns all the time, and so you need a fast renderer for that. So Cavalry is really fast. But the one of the problems is that in the 3D world, so in Maya, we wanted to build a tool in Maya before Cavalry existed, where you could say, I want to have a circle and a hexagon and a triangle, and I want them all to have different colors, but I kind of want to build them all at the same time. And we couldn't do that. There's no way to even trick the engine in Maya to give that ability to you. And so when we were building Cavalry, we were just aware of the shortcomings that we've had in other bits of software. So just from animating, I used to be an animator, custom animation. It's kind of we knew the problem where we were hitting problems, and we wanted to build software that would just solve all of our own problems. So we're building software that we want to use, basically, because we all have animation backgrounds. So it's kind of like second nature. Like, I want to work like this because I need this problem solving, because it turns out we all have the same problems.
And I think there's also that one of the important things that kind of emerged very early on was this kind of, Cavalry looks like a layer-based application, but it's actually node-based behind the scenes. So, again, going back to what Ian was saying, we are more akin to a 3D app than a 2D app, really. And one of the things that gives you, and this kind of harked back, Ian, to what you were saying around the early days of Mesh, where, you had scripted something, but nobody could use that script because nobody else understood that script. Right. I think it's a tangle that you can get into in After Effects as well, where you pick whipping away and writing expressions and everything, and then all of a sudden no one's got any clue as to how this scene goes together. Mm-hmm. And so, one of the goals with that kind of node-based workflow is that, and that's maybe a key difference that's worth explaining actually as well. When we've got a kind of pick whip equivalent, we call it a connection anchor. But what you're doing there is you're making connections to node behind the scenes. You are not writing JavaScript expressions. And what we hope this does, or we believe this does, is kind of surfaces some of the, the kind of the engineering, the thought that goes into whatever rig you're building, surfaces up there in a way that you just move some sliders around and something changes, rather than having to understand what an expression, a 10, 20 line expression is doing. And also we get a lot of speed ups from that node-based workflow as well. So, JavaScript is a fairly fast language, but not as fast as C++. So we can get much closer to the metal with some of the things doing with those node-based connections, and hence that's why you see, a lot of real-time stuff in Cavalry. You're far less likely to end up having to RAM preview anything in Cavalry, and you can move sliders in playback and move things around and kind of treat it more like a kind of playground, really. We hear lots of stories of people kind of hitting happy accidents in Cavalry where they didn't mean something to happen, but, that looks cool. Let's go with that now. So, that's been really fun to see.
Yeah, you bring up something interesting. So, one of the biggest gripes that artists have with any software they use is, I wish it worked faster. And I think typically the older the software, the slower it tends to feel, right? Because of technical debt and stuff like that. But because Cavalry's newer, and I've played around with it, and it does feel light years faster than when you're, trying to RAM preview something in After Effects typically. I'm curious if there's technical reasons for that. Is it just that, if an app is 25 years old, the render engine probably has a bunch of gremlins in it still. You've built it more modern, or are there newer techniques, or are you doing something different? Is it really just that it's written in C++? Like I'm not technical enough to understand why something would be so much faster.
A little of all of the above. I can't really speak to what's going on inside After Effects because I don't know, but we have a really super fast modern rendering engine. All of our shaders, filtering, previews, all that rendering, it's all GPU based. Everything has been almost from the beginning. And we designed it for these modern workflows. Definitely techniques have come on over time. I think that because modern machines have a lot more memory than old machines used to have, I think that probably it might be down to the fact that older software has had to work with some constraints, and so compromises have been made in the design of things just in order to make it work at all. And nowadays we don't have that constraints, and we don't have those constraints, and so that might be part of it as well. But yeah, I mean, as Chris was saying, so. Important to note, Cavalry is node-based behind the scenes, but we don't expose, you don't have to deal with them. It's all layer-based on top. I say that because I remember speaking to some motion designers who were just terrified of nodes, and that's fine. But it does give us a lot of optimization. So things, if they don't need to be calculated, they won't be, and that's kind of automatic. And so Cavalry can optimize for you. You don't need to go through and find what layers are being used or are completely hidden and all that kind of stuff. It just happens magically. So there are modern techniques being used, but it's I don't know. I don't quite know why After Effects is so slow, but I do know why Cavalry is fast.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, when I look at Cavalry, and it's interesting because I guess like conceptually, the fact that Cavalry is node based, it makes sense to me. I used to use Nuke all the time, so I kind of get the advantages of that workflow and the disadvantages. And that's, and I think technically behind the scenes, After Effects has some sort of node structure. There's like a node view you can open up. So I'm sure it's doing similar things, but the UI is not node based. But Cavalry, when I open it, it looks familiar to me as an After Effects artist. It doesn't look alien. So how difficult should an After Effects user, in your opinion, I know you guys are a little biased, but how difficult have you found it for After Effects artists to learn Cavalry?
The one I hear all the time is that our connections are the wrong way around from After Effects. So in Cavalry, you connect from here to here. And in After Effects, you say, I want to take this file. No, what do you do? It's the other way around anyway.
I'm parenting this to this instead of this is parented to this. Okay, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so we get people saying something right. When really, I would say After Effects is the wrong way around because Cavalry is just the same as everyone else. So we didn't do something novel here. We just copied what everyone else did. I remember
it's like kilometers and miles all over again, isn't it?
I remember someone coming on our Discord server saying, I've been using Cavalry for ages and then I needed to go back and do something in After Effects and I was making connections the wrong way around, and so we broke their mental model. We broke the mental model of After Effects.
Got it. Okay, so if that's the hardest thing to learn, that's a pretty good sign.
Well, so there's more. So traditional animation is similar. So keyframes, graph editor, time editor, all that kind of stuff is quite similar in Cavalry to After Effects. Cavalry is all vector based, so that's different. So we don't. So we do raster, but it's raster on like textured vectors basically. So for example, an image isn't just an image layer. An image is an image shader on a rectangle. So it's more kind of 3D in approach in that way. So there are things that might kind of take us just a second to adjust to. And another big one, I think, is probably how the render queue works. So in After Effects, now it might have changed actually. I haven't used After Effects for a while, but in After Effects, you used to have an item in the render queue. You'd render it, then it would disable, and you had to duplicate it or copy and paste it or whatever, make a new one in order to render again. So and then, like after a day's work, you'd have a list of render corpses basically in your editor. But in Cavalry, they hang around. So you set up a render item once, and it's there until you delete it basically, and so you can just render that again and again and again. And this allows us to do some really powerful things. Like for starters, you can render multiple compositions with the same render item. So if you have a naming setup that's the composition name plus something or whatever, and you've got your ProRes with audio and blah blah blah, so you can just hit render and it'll render out the 3 comps just with that one item. And it allows us to do all of our data kind of rendering. So you can render out the same composition 100 times using different languages or different names or whatever you need to do just from spreadsheet that you've imported or whatever. So it affords us all of that kind of thing. So the rendering will take a little bit of getting used to, but then if you're familiar with Cinema 4D, all the motion graphic stuff will be quite familiar. And then we have illustration tools and things, but which are probably more familiar to Illustrator users. We've gone a bit further than After Effects has gone in the drawing tools and things. Go on.
Yeah, I was going to say on that kind of going back to the node-based stuff. One of the kind of things that I say used to see was people who are kind of After Effects first coming to Cavalry would share a scene with us, and they would have 8 drop shadows. Whereas in Cavalry, because it's node-based, you just need 1 drop shadow, assuming all the drop shadows are the same, and you just connect that same drop shadow into whichever layers you need a drop shadow on. And that was just really interesting. We just assumed that people would kind of go, well, just put a drop shadow and you connect it to all the ones. But of course, if you're coming from that After Effects brain, you have a drop shadow and you duplicate that layer, all the effects get duplicated with it, and then you're left having to, you can obviously kind of connect those up with expressions and sliders and all sorts of things. But that was really interesting. That was a kind of, we need to tell people not to do that. You don't need to do that in Cavalry. And then the other nice thing on the vector-based stuff that we get some really nice feedback on is that idea that Cavalry is vector first, so that you can export SVG. You can just copy SVG to your clipboard and you can paste it into something like Figma, Affinity Designer, Illustrator. Applications like Drive support that as well. Mm-hmm. And likewise, you can go the other way around. So you can come, directly out of Figma, paste something into Cavalry, and then start animating it in there. And I think that's been a real breath of fresh air for a lot of people who, there's some fantastic plugins out there that help you go from Illustrator particularly into After Effects. But yeah, I think people get frustrated with the idea of, why can't I just take my artwork and drop it in? And because Cavalry is vector-based, you can do that. And obviously you get that whole, we're kind of resolution independent effectively. You can go up to any scale that you like because it's all vector-based behind the scenes. So, I think as Ian says, if you're coming from After Effects, come and give it a go for sure. There's definitely a little mental model bump. I think there's ways that you can work in Cavalry that are a bit more systematic than maybe you might be used to working in After Effects. But I think once people unlock that, they're off and into this whole new world of kind of crazy experimentation. And I hope that we kind of cover both worlds. We as Ian says, you can still do the traditional animation. We have keyframes. We have, what we call visibility layers. In our time editor, you can do some, non-linear editing, those kind of things. But you also have this node-based weird and wonderful things, and that brings in the data and the automation. And, as Ian says, exporting 100, 1,000, a million things out of one template composition. So, we're really trying to sort of join the dots up in that respect.
Let me ask you about a really specific thing, because, listen, then, Ian, when you were talking about, the way that you have sort of a render setup that you can reuse, and, Chris talking about, you don't need 8 instances of the drop shadow effect. You could have 1. I mean, it really sounds like the way I used to, when I was learning Nuke and I had to really rewire my brain because I'd been using After Effects for years. And it's like, oh, you don't render, there's a write node. And you can pipe whatever you want into it and it writes the file. And if you have 8 layers and you want to drop shadow, you add a merge node. You merge them first, then you put the drop shadow on. And the order you do things becomes a conscious choice. Whereas in After Effects, it's a little bit more abstracted away in some cases, which I think makes it easier to learn. I think it's a good thing. But then when you really want to get into the weeds and optimize your scenes, it's a lot trickier. And so I'm curious, like, I don't know, like, is this node-based setup, I mean, is it something that comes from your compositing background? Is there, is it sort of a performance choice to do it that way?
It's a performance choice.
Okay.
So, well, 2 things. It's a performance choice, and it's also the way of working, I think, is really efficient for like modern workflow techniques, and it's really deliberate. It's really deliberate, and you can make intentional connections, and then you can see them, so you know what's happening, you know what's affecting what. And I think it's quite an explicit way of working. So yeah, I do like the workflow side of things, but it's performance. There's a little bit to be said. It's also what we're used to working with, because we've worked with Nuke, we've worked with Maya, which is node based as well. And so there's that side of things. But from a UX point of view, it's very much layer based. So you're doing these things, but it's all behind the scenes, all of that stuff.
That's so cool. Yeah, you're making me want to go play around with it as soon as we're done here. So one big question, and I've been asked this question and I don't actually know the answer, so I'm glad you guys are here. I think, I was talking to Chris before we started recording. I mentioned, I'm an advisor for Rive, and early on I used to see Guido, who's the founder. He would spend a lot of time online sort of comparing Rive to Lottie because that's sort of the obvious, kind of competition. And he said publicly that he doesn't really look at it as competition, but it's because their customers come to them so often saying, well, why are you better than Lottie? Or why should I use you over Lottie? And so the number one thing I hear about Cavalry when people have questions is, well, I know After Effects, so why should I learn Cavalry? Are they competitors? How do you guys look at where Cavalry sits in relation to After Effects, which is, from now until probably eternity, going to be the most widely used motion design app in the world?
Yeah, I think, we were given the moniker of, After Effects killer when there were the early rumblings of Cavalry, and we were sending out a few little experiments on our Instagram channel. And, that's lovely. But actually, we definitely don't see ourselves as going head to head with something like After Effects. After Effects is really, started life as a compositor. We've started life as a motion graphics tool, and I think there are two really important distinctions to make. Totally get the comparisons. I think, those kind of Rive, Lottie comparisons are exactly the same. After Effects users are people who we think would enjoy Cavalry. There are people outside of After Effects that we think would also enjoy Cavalry, but there's obviously a big pool of people there who understand animation, can quickly see where Cavalry could benefit them. And so we've really got users now that are using, we've got some users who have never used After Effects in their life and they know Cavalry. And they're very happy in Cavalry, doing all the things that Cavalry does. And we've got users who are using Cavalry to generate certain elements of their scenes and then taking them into a compositor. It might be After Effects, and finishing off projects in that way. And so it's a real broad spectrum, I think, of people, because, we're also finding that we're really attractive to kind of more traditional design agencies and creative agencies. So, outside animation, people are looking at it from a print point of view as well, because we've got SVG and Vector. Cavalry is kind of a natural bedfellow for those worlds. And so, yeah, we definitely get the comparison. We're not trying to fight it too much, but at the same time, we're realistic. Adobe is an enormous organization. It's not just After Effects that attracts people to After Effects as a tool. There's all sorts of other things at play there. So, we're nipping away at their heels, but we're definitely not trying to. You could say that in 10 years' time we might change our tune, but at the moment we're really happy with where we are, being a kind of and a complement to that sort of pipeline, whatever it is you're working in.
Yeah, I want to dig into that in a minute, because I think you're exactly right. I mean, and I was actually making this point today. I recorded our Motion Mondays video for next week today, and I was comparing. We do this MoGraph trivia thing, and by the time this episode comes out, it'll already air. So I'm not giving away the answer. But the trivia was, has there ever really been a competitor to After Effects in the desktop space? And, currently there's apps like Cavalry, there's HitFilm, there's some really cool ones out there. But true competitors, the only one I could think of really was Combustion, which I'm sure you guys must have come across at some point. And Apple Motion for a minute was actually kind of hot and actually has some really cool features in it. But the point I was making was that it's not After Effects that is the reason it's so dominant. It's everything around it. It's the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
And if you're going to try to take on After Effects, you gotta recreate all of that. You gotta have the educational options, and you gotta have the community, and you gotta have the plugin ecosystem, all that kind of stuff. But before I ask you guys questions about this and dig into it, I want to know, for people listening, what are some use cases that you're seeing for Cavalry where people are coming to you, they're getting a license, and then they're doing things that would be so much harder to do in another app? Like, what's kind of the ideal use case? Before we get to that answer, I want to remind you that we have the only interactive full curriculum of online design and animation training on the planet. The fall 2024 session starts next week, and you still have time to jump in to learn Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects, Cinema 4D, design, animation, illustration, and much more with help from industry pros and an amazing group of students from all over the world. You get unlimited feedback on your coursework, a super engaged community, monthly live streams, and much more. Head to schoolofmotion.com for all of the details and reach out to our team if you have any questions. All right, back to Chris and Ian.
So, I think the obvious one to tackle there is the kind of the higher volume stuff. So a good example is a studio called Stink Studios, and they worked on a project for a band called Revolut, who I don't think are in the States actually, but fairly big across Europe. And those guys needed different aspect ratios, different products, so they had different kind of artwork being fed into the system, different languages, and basically they had this kind of spreadsheet. So they were using we've got a Google Sheet integration, so there's various ways you can bring data into Cavalry, but these guys were using the Google Sheet integration, and they had this enormous matrix of it's this aspect ratio, it's this frame rate, it's this color, it's this text coming in, it's this disclaimer on the bottom, all these kind of there's some kind of slightly boring things going on there, but the creative itself was really nice. But that process around managing all that stuff is obviously a fairly onerous task. And what worked really well in that situation, there was a few things. One, Cavalry could do it. Cavalry could kind of handle that kind of workflow. But what came out of that was that they were able to almost like work in parallel. So, a typical situation might be that a client sends you some data, send your producer some data. The producer sends that to the artist, and the artist has to turn that data into something that they can then use within their creative, however they're going to do that. They then render everything out. They then send it back to their producer, who then sends it to the client, who then says, no, not like that. Or there's a spelling mistake here, or we didn't mean that. That's wrong in there. So what was really interesting, the producer was able to work with the client directly on populating all the information into the spreadsheet. Make sure that that's completely sanitized in there, being very clear that if it's wrong in here, it's going to be wrong in whatever we send you coming out of the creative process. And so that's happening on one end, but at the same time, the artists are able to kind of work in parallel, build their template, build all the different rules that, whatever they need to build to kind of make that work. And they can actually use live data, so they can use the data that's coming in from the spreadsheet, and they can kind of test things out, see if German's going to break everything, because it's you get so much text if you're translating something to German,
right?
And so the two things were able to work in parallel, and it just saves a huge amount of backwards and forwards as well in terms of, oh, by the way, I've updated something here, send it to the producer, send it to the artist, find the cell that's got to go in, update it. It's all happening in that you've got this kind of point, which is the kind of source. Of all the information. And effectively, they were able to press render. And I think in that one, it wasn't super high volume. I think they had about 4,000 deliverables. I say not super high volume. It's kind of...
That sounds high volume to me, Chris. Good luck.
We've done a million, so...
Oh, my God.
Yeah, Cavalry can go a lot higher. But it reminded me of... so Adam, one of the other co-founders, he sort of co-founded... he founded Mainframe... almost quarter of a century ago now, so a long time ago. He and I were working on a project for Nickelodeon years and years ago for Mainframe, but we had to do all of this type of thing by hand. We had different frame rates, different aspect ratios, different end frames, and we had to watch this what effectively looked like the same thing, over and over again, and it was just mind numbing. And I think that I'm really proud that no one else has to do that now because Cavalry exists. So.
There used to be good money in it though, but yeah, you're right.
As a class of problem, versioning has been solved by Cavalry. That's for sure.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. I mean, the stuff that I see when I'm on Instagram or something, or someone posts something on social media, it always catches my eye is the generative stuff. Because I remember when Cinema 4D kind of became really popular, and especially when they added the MoGraph tools and Grayscale Gorilla kind of started popularizing them. And all of a sudden you could do these really crazy looking things in a few minutes and play with it and change the colors. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that sort of stuff is built in Cavalry. Is it similar to Cinema 4D system?
Yeah, I suppose so. In that we have... I don't know what the terminology is in Cinema 4D. We have fields, so we call them for loss. I think they're fields in Cinema 4D, maybe.
Yeah, they're fields.
So they're shapes basically that you can affect things with. And in Cavalry, they can be kind of radial, or it can be circle, or it can be square, linear, or it can be a mesh. Effector. So you can use these kind of things to affect something in some way, and then what you then affecting it with is just our suite of behaviors, which is just this kind of really general purpose toolkit that isn't specific to the kind of like equivalent of a cloner. So it isn't specific to our duplicator. These things work everywhere in the app. So you could plug in the equivalent of a random random effector.
Mm-hmm.
You can plug in the equivalent of that into just a position or something like that in Cavalry. So it doesn't just work with our motion graphics tools. These things just work everywhere. Which is another kind of way of simplifying the learning curve just by making these concepts work everywhere.
I think we sort of open the door to that as well, intentionally so as well. That, if you're looking at kind of work that's maybe produced in processing or P5 or something like that, a lot of that stuff's completely inaccessible to, a non-developer, let's say.
Correct.
I would, as I say, I'm not a developer. I would really struggle kind of working like that. But with the Cavalry, it gives you kind of similar paradigms. There are similar paradigms to the way you might code something. And so therefore you can set up systems that look really, really similar to that stuff. And you feel very, very clever when you do it as well, because, you think, wow, look what I did. And there's quite an interesting sort of anecdote around there. We work quite closely with Studio Dunbar on some of their demo festival. I don't know if you're familiar, Joey, with demo festival. In fact, I'm sure you are. It's a big festival that Dunbar pulled together, and all sorts of different artists come across. And we were really lucky to be working with them on both the branding and then also see Cavalry work being used within the festival itself as well. So that was really cool. But Sander at Dunbar was he was kind of like he was the bottleneck. He understood processing and he did all the kind of clever processing stuff. But what it meant is all the other artists were a bit kind of like, right, Sander, can I now push this through you? And they actually ended up rebuilding a lot of their systems that were traditionally going through processing and putting those into Cavalry. We actually helped them with a kind of a special deformer that the guys in the dev team helped build based on some of the stuff they were doing before. And the really good thing about this is that Sander said, I walked into the office and there were 6 people using Cavalry rather than all waiting for me to get in and do something for him. So we kind of really opened the doors there, just because, like you say, kind of that procedural and generative stuff is far more accessible to kind of more artistic-minded people.
There's a real parallel there with how Mesh started. So one person's doing all the scripting, coding stuff, and they want everyone else to take the lead. So there is a parallel there.
You learned your lesson. So I want to ask you about this. So I actually hadn't heard of the demo festival, but it that word demo, there used to be something called the demo scene. Are you guys familiar with that? Like from back in like the mid and late 90s. And it was basically artists creating these 3D renders that weren't really 3D renders. They were like completely made with code. And I became infatuated with them. And I remember buying a book. It must have been a book because I was probably like 10 and trying to figure out but it was all math. You had to describe a sphere using like the mathematical formula for it and stuff like that. And it was interesting though, because you can get on YouTube and you can see early examples of that stuff. I know Gmonk was inspired by that. And it's very experimental just by the nature of the tools that you have to do it, right? And, hearing you guys talk about Cavalry and the philosophy behind it and the way it works, it kind of reminded me of that, because if you want to go into After Effects and just play around and make something experimental, you can do that, but you kind of have to you have to start with something and you have to build it up and then you throw filters on it. And it's a little bit more manual, but because of the way like Cinema 4D works, you can take a sphere and you can throw it in a cloner and then you can put a deformer on it and then you put a field on it. And all of a sudden you get this thing that you almost couldn't aim at, right? You almost just arrive at it and think it's cool and then iterate from there. And so I don't know, I'm just kind of like brain dumping here, but like it sounds like Cavalry kind of lends itself to that. Do you find that to be the case where artists can just kind of start throwing things together a little bit quicker and getting these abstract results?
For sure. Chris, wasn't he one of the early adopters?
He was a big MASH fan.
Oh, MASH fan.
Surprised me,
Yeah, he was a big MASH fan.
Software confused.
We had some real spacey conversations with Gmonk.
He's a special man.
He's a brain. He's got a brain. Yeah.
Yeah, but as far as the experimental nature of it, though, like, does that ring true to you guys?
For sure. Yeah, it's playful, right? So all of these tools, which are kind of like encapsulating the kind of the beauty and the power of mathematics in a really easy and approachable way. and that are kind of like nicely bundled into understandable chunks. So they're not overwhelming. So you kind of break it down into kind of something that's understandable. And then you provide users with those, and then they just can play. So we have this rule in Cavalry that anything plugs into anything, which doesn't always work, but that's the idea. You can plug anything into anything.
It's aspirational, yeah.
Yeah, right. So you can make a random or a noise or an oscillator, so that's like sine waves, and you can plug it into color, you can plug it into position, rotation, you can plug it anywhere, right? And it will just work. You can plug it into a shape itself, and all of these things they just work. So it lends itself to this playfulness because you don't have to think about, oh, if I'm going to do this, is that a scripting or is that this, or do I need a filter for that? It's all the same thing in Cavalry. So yeah, it's very, very intentionally built for that kind of a playful workflow.
And I think also with that, Ian, you can learn concepts. So random's an easy concept to learn, right? It spits out random values, but the fact that you now understand what random does means you can apply it to anything, and you can think, I wonder if this would randomize the colors on this. And yeah, it can. Or I wonder if this will randomly move these up and down in position Y. And yeah, it does. So, as soon as you kind of start understanding these concepts, they can just be used anywhere across the application in anything that you're doing. So it really opens up all the possibilities very quickly.
This is a really important point that you've hit on there, Chris, because when you learn for an end user, I have the idea that I want to do something like I want to put a random number on here, or I want a random color on here, and in Cavalry, when this is it's the same workflow, you only have to learn it once. You don't need to learn the different workflows. So, for example, an example that I like to use normally is that if you want to make something move around kind of in a noisy way in After Effects, you've got a wiggle expression. If you want to affect the outline of it in some way, then you're going to use either a filter or you're going to write an expression that will move the points. In Cinema 4D, it's a noise deformer, and then if you want to move something around, then you're going to use either an expression, espresso, or you're going to cloner and then take the value out of the cloner somehow. So they're different workflows. In Cavalry, the idea is it's just noise or it's just random, right? So the end goal is the same. The concept is the same. So why make people learn two different workflows? So the reason that these other apps have two different workflows is because technically they're different. So making the shape of something go noisy, kind of wobbly, whatever, technically that's one thing. And making the position of it move around in another way, technically that's another thing. In Cavalry, the end goal is noise. The outcome the user wants to achieve is noise. And so we've bundled, we've swallowed the technical difference and we provide you with just noise. And then you just use that in all the situations. So it's all like I say, it's all very intentional that you work like this.
I want to see if I understand this. So the noise, I'm imagining sort of like a sine wave that's kind of noisy like this and you could pipe that into the position of like individual vertices of a shape, or the anchor point of the shape itself, or the stroke width of the shape, or the R component of the RGB value. Is that kind of how it works?
Exactly. It's exactly like that. So yeah, and you don't, it's not different expressions, it's not different, like we swallow all of the technical differences and you just drag a connection and then you're done. So yeah.
That's very cool. Okay. So you're I have to dive into Cavalry now. It's so funny. I had such a different impression of the app before talking to you guys. And I mentioned our mutual friend, Ryan Plummer, who used to work for School Motion, and he will not shut up about Cavalry. He's been trying to get me on the Cavalry train for a while. So I think this is the conversation to do it. I want to hear a little bit about the sort of the non-software things that it takes to actually grow a software and get more users. Obviously, you guys have to do marketing and tell people about it and all of that. But I assume you knew that going in. But, I mentioned earlier, After Effects also has like 1 million educational outlets that teach it, and it's got this plugin ecosystem with everything you can imagine. What are the things that, you guys are going to be building over the next several years to try and reinforce the Cavalry ecosystem?
So, Cavalry is pretty young, right? So we're still adding some what people might consider basic functionality. So while we have really strong procedural text tools, for example, like color every instance of the word "the" red, you can do that really easily in Cavalry. We don't have OpenType yet, so OpenType is going into beta literally next week, I think. So that's like internal testing. So things like that, which people might consider table stakes, we're still getting them, but coming really soon. So there's that. We've got particles, which are in beta testing, and we'll be polishing those off soon. Crikey, what else are we working on? So skeletons and IK, we've got R&D on that, and we'd like to move in that direction. We've got some really cool modern techniques for binding and skinning. So using really modern VFX style techniques. So no kind of vertex weights in numbers and boxes. So we're using much more modern technique for that kind of thing.
Thank you.
And yeah, so there. Yeah, I know. Honestly,
You're missing the holy grail of a gradient along a path as well, Ian.
oh, great! Yeah, of course, gradient along the path is coming.
They said it couldn't be done,
Yeah. So it's a lot harder than I thought it was. So with dash support as well. So that's coming in. We don't have tapered stroke support for gradient along a path yet. So tapered strokes, we have tapered strokes, but they don't work with gradient along stroke yet. But we do have dash support for gradient along stroke, and that's in the current version of Cavalry, the current test beta version. There's lots going on, lots cooking. But there's always more to do.
Ian, are there plans to extend Cavalry? Because you made the distinction that After Effects started as a compositing tool and sort of became also a motion design tool. Cavalry started as a motion design tool. Is there any movement towards compositing, adding footage support, stuff like that?
So my stock answer to this is that After Effects is compositing very well. And so if we're going to go into that realm, we better be really good at it. And at the moment, we're kind of filling out what we're good at. We're still kind of making sure that we're solid on all of that stuff.
Yep.
And likewise with 3D, there's 3D software that's absolutely amazing. So, we have 2.5D, we have cameras in Cavalry, but we're going to leave the 3D stuff to the 3D apps for now. I think it is inevitable that compositing features will leak into Cavalry. I think that is just going to happen because, we have filters, you can do levels, you can do channel swapping, you can do all that kind of stuff. So there are some very basic things there. I mean, even blend modes could be considered compositing, and we have alpha mats and things like that. But it's a very slippery slope. And so before we make a determined effort to tackle that, we definitely need to just round out the feature set for making sure that what we've set out to do Cavalry is absolutely brilliant at. And then I guess over to Chris for the vision.
Yeah, that's wise.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, you mentioned, Adobe's kind of moat with the, that third-party plugin system. It's just some amazing plugins being created.
Okay.
Marketplace is definitely something on the radar. It's a good opportunity to call out Scenery.io, which is actually a third-party a platform, and by a guy called Remco, who we speak to almost every day. And we've built lots of things in the API specifically for Remco to kind of make a marketplace possible. And, it's definitely something that we need to expand on with Remco and with ourselves. That's including things like, so you can download scene files. Everything's free at the moment, so you can download scene files from there. The community's been incredibly generous in terms of uploading their work, and then you can come in and break them down and kind of remix them and do whatever you want to do with them. But that's also going to kind of extend out to script. So we've got Cavalry also ships with JavaScript APIs. So that also means you can communicate with other APIs. So you can bring data in from sports data, weather data, Typeform, those kind of things. So you can drive all your creative in that way. But yeah, there's lots of guys now and girls are building scripts on top of Cavalry using that JavaScript API as well. So you can build your own tooling on top, much like you do with a plugin in After Effects. In terms of that kind of bigger vision piece, I think as Ian's kind of alluded to, there is no shortage of things in the backlog to keep us busy every day. But we're all about connecting up that design and creativity with the automation side of things. And, we're already a fair way down that track, but we've also got things like a cloud renderer. We've got some R&D on a cloud renderer. So, when you do get to that higher volume stuff, have you got the power in-house to do that yourself? If not, you can use, we're building that on top of AWS at the moment, so you can scale up to 20, 100 machines or whatever and fire out however many renders you need to fire out. I should point out the Cavalry's a little bit too fast at the moment to actually need a cloud renderer in a way. We've Ian mentioned so we've got a guy Daniel who's run an experiment. He's rendered 1 million outputs from Cavalry, and he's done that all on one. He's done that on one machine. So big clap. Yeah, all bespoke. But it's fantastic to be enabling, basically a one-man band like Daniel to be able to kind of offer those type of things to his customers. So he can now take on much bigger projects that maybe would ordinarily be only be available to kind of the bigger agencies. So that sort of thing is there. And the other really interesting thing that we've got going on at the moment, and these kind of all connect into each other, but we've got a product in testing at the moment with a small group of users. It's under a kind of code name of Cavalry Control. And this is really, again, I guess if we're speaking to After Effects users, there's kind of similarities to essential properties here. The idea being you have a composition and you're able to promote certain controls that you can then, in the case of After Effects, you might open that project in Premiere and then you'll only see those particular attributes. We see a few problems with the current workflow with After Effects and Premiere. One being that you are expecting the end user to be using a professional bit of software like After Effects. There's buttons all over the place that your, maybe kind of a non-literate animator would not know how to use. It's I don't know how many gig is it at the moment to download After Effects. I think it's like 3 gigabyte download or something. And also there's the other side of it is something that really frustrated us at Mainframe was being asked to hand over our source files to clients. Often we had clever little, bits of IP essentially in those files. And we were essentially being told, well, if you want this project, we need the source files at the end of the day, and we need to give those away. And so what Cavalry Control is, what Cavalry Control is within Cavalry itself, we have a feature called the Control Center. And originally this was designed for rigging. So the idea that you might have a character blinking an eye and there's a null and there's something else and there's a thing under that, and all you really want is one of those properties to be able to slide it around. The idea with the Control Center was that you could promote that to the Control Center and then have a window just with a selection of particularly pertinent attributes. And what Cavalry Control is basically is you've got that kind of completely open-ended creative platform in Cavalry. So you can build anything you like. You can then take, let's say, the position of a circle, the color of that rectangle, and the text of this particular shape here, and you promote those things to the Control Center. When somebody, and let's say you're somebody in a kind of marketing department, you're not an animator, you're not a designer, you open that in Cavalry Control, all you see is the viewport, some playback controls, and then just those 3 attributes that we've given you, and then a way to render that out. And so we're really interested in this from the point of people being asked to create design systems for their clients, and they then want to hand over those files and their clients then want to go and kind of run that and be able to change things really, really quickly and on the fly. And so we're really interested in this, and it all lends into this kind of systematic approach to design where you can then, as I say, you keep the complexity. So there are lots of platforms that you can download templates from, but you obviously, as a professional animator, you're going to hit a brick wall with those templates where, this doesn't do that. With Cavalry, you keep all that. You keep the open-ended side of it, but you're able to present that in a really simplified, like dumbed-down interface for anyone that's not as kind of experienced in animation. So we're really excited about that. We've got that out to a few select people at the moment, just trying to gain some feedback, find out what they like, what they don't like. But hopefully it gives you kind of a sense of the direction. On top of that, we've talked about Rive. We have got some R&D around runtime. So the fact that you could play back Cavalry scene files natively in a browser, again, that kind of harks back to that vector workflow. We've effectively got vector shapes. They can be rendered by a browser. And hopefully, if you join the dots here, you could have something like Cavalry Control could then be in a browser and you're able to preview things and make amends and render things out from there. So Brilliant. It's ambitious, but that's the direction that we're going in.
That's really cool. I was going to ask you this, and I think you kind of answered it, but maybe you can position this a little bit better than me. One of the things that we get asked the most about right now with the economy still being kind of weird is just, how do I get work? How do I differentiate? If you're a freelancer, how do I expand, my offerings and let clients know? And one of the things that Aaron, who's our marketing director, he talks a lot about how when new tools come out, it's really challenging to kind of get a toehold in the artist market when there's a new tool, and you guys have done that. But to really get mass adoption, the thing that really helps is having work out there that like you can get paid to use this tool now.
Yeah.
But I see the same kind of challenge with Rive is still very new. Cavalry is still pretty new. The clients that could take advantage of artists who know it really well don't know that it exists or know what its capabilities are.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of the artist's job to see that and then go out and educate, or like the studio's job, right? So if you were, trying to help people who are interested in Cavalry, they're thinking about learning it, but it would be helpful if they knew, if I learn it, now I can go tell my clients this, and they'll be excited about this, and they'll hire me. What is the thing that Cavalry opens up from a business perspective for artists?
Yeah, so I think that there's a kind of answer. There's a sort of pre-answer to that question, which is almost like one of the other challenges that we faced is not only just getting artists to understand that Cavalry exists and what it does, but the other end of that is the clients, so the brands maybe that are commissioning the work. A really good sort of frustrating example of this is something that we did with Mainframe that would have been absolutely perfect for Cavalry, but we were kind of forced by Apple, who wanted the source files, and they knew After Effects. And so we had to do it in After Effects. Now, that is changing. So, we are now, our kind of growth curve is now, we're getting some of these bigger names on board from a brand point of view. So the Apples, the Metas, the ByteDances, these guys are now signing up for Cavalry.
Cool.
And so this is where hopefully there is, I think you're alluding to, Joey, that there needs to be a marketplace for people to use the software that they can then hand their, not necessarily hand their scene files over. A lot of time clients don't need to know what software you're using, but in those situations, clients often want that. They need to trust that what you're doing is something that they're familiar with, and that you know what you're doing, and they've heard of that product. And so that is happening now. That's been definitely a slower process than we imagined when we first kicked off Cavalry, but we feel like we're right in that sweet spot now. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I think sort of that in between. We need people working on Cavalry to convince the brands, and we need the brands to be asking the studios to be working in Cavalry as well. So we're trying to attack it from both sides.
So it's also worth mentioning that if you can do the work in Cavalry, then it's faster in Cavalry, basically. So it's not just about convincing your clients that I can do this now. It's more that I can, finish work early, see my kids more, because it's so much faster to do the work in there. That said, if it can do it, because like I say, not the workflows are in Cavalry yet.
Yeah, I mean this Cavalry control. And I don't know. I think you guys should lean into the puns more too. It's called Cavalry. You could call that tool Jockey. Yeah, I mean there's a whole bunch of this is a gold mine.
Believe me, we've been there.
Yeah, I'm sure you've beaten that dead horse. But I mean, when you're talking about the Cavalry control, I mean, to me, and it's honestly surprising to me that isn't a more popular business model. I know companies are out there doing it. You've got Algo, Fraser from Cub Studio has MoShare, and there's a few companies kind of going after this where it's like motion design at scale for non-animators to be able to kind of get versioning from. But it's cool that it's built right into the tool. And I just wonder, like, how have the artists responded to that? Because to me, that's a game changer. That's really, really exciting. That is literally a new service that you can now offer that, an After Effects artist could also offer, but it's much harder to kind of set that up and make it stable. So I'm curious if you found that like that messaging is working, as well as, hey, look at how cool this is. Look at how fast it is.
Yeah, definitely it is working. The thing that I'd say that's slowing it down is that those projects don't come in every day. So, we're often what people say, right, next one of these that comes in, I'm using Cavalry for it. And obviously then we're sort of waiting to hear back from them on that. But yeah, it is definitely working. People are using it for exactly those things. I think there is there's a confidence issue, and what I mean by that is not necessarily in Cavalry, but just in terms of, am I getting myself into a project? This client wants, let's say 1 million renders. Do I really want to be responsible for 1 million renders? So, I think the more case studies that we can get out that people have done these kind of things, and Cavalry has been stable and performed brilliantly for them, I think the more confidence people will have to do that, because it's not just on the technical side, it's on the, I really want a client who needs a 1 million renders breathing down my neck when it's not quite worked out as I thought it would. So I think it's a paradigm shift in terms of, like a 30-second explainer video to rendering out 1 million things. That they're kind of two different worlds. But yeah, Ryan, who you've mentioned a few times, he's definitely going down that road with Cavalry, and we need to catch up with him and find out what he's up to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a new category of product, right? I mean, if we're kind of putting it in business terms, right? I talk a lot about Rive these days, and it's kind of the same issue where it's kind of a new way of working, and you have to not only let artists know that it exists, you have to let developers know it exists, so they have this extra problem you guys don't necessarily have.
Yeah.
And then clients have to understand why they should care and why they should want people to be doing this in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a marketing challenge on the artist to let clients know, I can offer you this. This is a new thing that you couldn't have before, and now I can offer it.
Yeah.
You're just getting me thinking. You're getting my gears turning. I love talking about the business side of things. So so thanks for sharing all that.
The other side of it is, we're very conscious that when you talk about automation, you immediately spring to boring, templated things. What we're really trying to do with Cavalry is make sure that, again, it's kind of harking back to that. Cavalry can do all the things it can do, and you can take any value and you can promote it up, and you can have that be affected, and that can do, if it's something more generative art like, you can use Cavalry to do those kind of things, and that can be a design system in itself. So we want to make sure that automation doesn't be boring, or when we're saying automation, we're saying you can take the creativity and automate it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's unbounded creativity distilled to a few controls put into an intuitive package. That's basically what we're aiming for there.
Are there any other, you've mentioned a few projects already, and I love this 1 million render kind of Guinness Book of World Records attempt that you mentioned. Are there other, are there any, high profile clients using it, or use cases that you've seen where you're like, I didn't even know you could do that. That's really cool.
I mean, we've got some, we mentioned design agencies earlier as opposed to kind of animation studios. So, big company like Pentagram has been using Cavalry, and they have been using that both for animation and, kind of mentioned the print work earlier as well. So they've done a few projects they've managed to share with us for clients like EDP, which are energy provider, and another client called Echo. And that's been really nice to see, because that you then see different bits of creative in different contexts. So you'll see it on a kind of bus stop poster, you'll see it in a browser, you'll see it kind of on a TV screen. So that's been really interesting to see Cavalry used across all those different concepts. We mentioned Dunbar and Demo. That was a really fun project for us. Agencies like Plus One in Amsterdam have been using Cavalry again in more in that kind of design system way. And that was kind of a Future of Britain, which is a kind of government and technology thing that we've got here in the UK. And there's also little things like Buck. Buck are now championing. Well, they have been championing Cavalry for a while, but they're getting more and more involved. And we're really pleased to see. I went to the InMotion festival, Playgrounds in Motion festival last year, and I just thought the branding was incredible. And so I was absolutely thrilled when we see Instagram posts where Cavalry's been involved in part of that. So
nice.
It's just it's amazing when if anyone out there thinking of starting a software business, do it with creative software, because people make amazing things and make your software look amazing. So it's really, really good.
Yeah, it probably helps in those cold, dark nights when churn is high, and you can at least look at that. So, well, thank you guys so much for your time. I have one more question, and you've been making me think. I'm really glad that we talked, because my mental model of what Cavalry was, I think, was incorrect, and I'm really, really interested in playing with it now. But it makes me think of how I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was still doing client work, I mean, really there was like 3 or 4 apps you needed to know to basically do any kind of work you'd be hired to do. And now it feels like there's 20 apps you could learn, and everyone's got their own unique little talent stack. And it really, there's this new frontier of kind of real-time motion design with Unreal and Rive. And it sounds like Cavalry maybe in the future has the capability of playing, in real time on the web and doing things there. And so motion designers now have a lot more room, to kind of explore these apps. And so I agree with your take that I think, looking at Cavalry as kind of this additional tool that you can leverage with After Effects or, probably eventually with Unreal Engine as a texture, the way Rive works too. And so I'd love to hear from you what, and I know this changes probably daily, but what's the grand vision here? You mentioned you're still, getting certain types of fonts to load in Cavalry. There's still some basic things you're working on. But once all that's out of the way, in 10 years, what's kind of like the grand vision and where are you guys aiming?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of harks back to, the conversation we're having around kind of artists and brands and making sure that Cavalry can exist all the way across that whole, that anyone who's worked in kind of creative production knows that, one bit of software is often not going to do everything. But we definitely feel that Cavalry can do the illustration, the animation, bring the data in, do the automation, and then, one thing we're not doing at the moment is kind of distribution on the other end of it. And really, we would like to be the household name that everybody thinks of when it comes to working on, predominantly professional production. I think is our focus. Cavalry's a premium model, so you can come in and have a play with it and play around, and we see some really interesting experiments there. But we want to be a big part of everybody's professional day-to-day creative toolkit.
I want to thank Chris and Ian so much for coming on the pod to share the story of Cavalry and for being so honest about the challenges that come along with building a new piece of animation software. I don't know about you, but I'm fired up to go play with Cavalry now and see what kind of procedural shenanigans I can get up to. So check out Cavalry at cavalry.scenegroup.co. There's a free version that you can download to play around with and some great tutorials on Scene Group's YouTube channel to get you started. And I want to know, have you used Cavalry? Let us know in the comments and make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss any of the amazing guests we have lined up. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.